Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today we're diving into the darkest corner of the wizarding world, where a snake hisses from a skull and fear has a name. The Death Eaters. Voldemort's army. Legend and terror, fanaticism and betrayal, pride and cowardice, all mixed into one sinister cocktail. We'll examine little-known, controversial, and sometimes downright senseless facts about these followers of the Dark Lord. Some of them might make you question, were they really as dangerous as we thought? Enjoy the video. Number 1. The wizarding world is too small. Let's start with a fact that turns everything on its head. Magical Britain isn't a vast empire, it's a cozy village where everyone went to the same school. Hogwarts is considered the finest school in the country, but even at its peak, it holds maybe 1,000 students, 1,000 for all of wizarding Britain. Now imagine, this tight-knit world gives rise to an underground organization bent on domination, but every member of that group knows someone who went to school with them, or lived next door, or is a distant cousin, one captured Death Eater, cracking under pressure or failing to resist legitimacy, could have exposed them all. No need for the ministry. The Order of the Phoenix and a few drops of Veritaserum would bring the entire network down like a house of cards. Number 2, there were far too few of them. You can be the most powerful dark wizard of the century, but you can't build an empire alone. Voldemort gathered followers, sure, but how many were true Death Eaters? The books and films mention maybe 30 names at most. That's laughably small to take over the entire magical world. Yes, he had wealthy, influential allies like Lucius Malfoy. But do you really think Lucius personally delivered orders or got his hands dirty? Where are the thousands of fanatics, the ones ready to fight to the death? Even Voldemort's snatchers, his enforcers, came off more like a disorganized rabble than a real army. Number 3. Why did they surrender so quickly? These people called themselves the chosen elite, the pure-blood aristocracy. They believed they had the right to rule. They served he who must not be named with fanatical loyalty. But the moment Voldemort fell, that was it. No resistance, no guerrilla warfare, no final stand, not even a symbolic sacrifice. They just disappeared. Some claimed they were under the Imperious curse. Others went into hiding. Was no one willing to continue the fight? Or was their belief in power merely fear of Voldemort himself? Number 4. Masks and wands. Death Eaters looked terrifying. Ominous cloaks, silver masks, faceless phantoms of dread. That's why the masks, if each one used their personal wand. And wands, as we know, are unique. Ollivander remembers them all. A wand leaves a trace that can be tracked. When a Death Eater casts a spell, they're leaving a business card with their home address. The mask only works on Muggles. Wizards are not that naive. Number 5. The Dark Mark, symbol and vulnerability. Every Death Eater had a tattoo burned into their arm by Voldemort, a skull with a snake, a symbol not just of horror, but of a magical GPS tracker. One touch from Voldemort and you had to appear. You couldn't turn it off, ignore it, or claim you didn't notice. Symbol of fear, loyalty, and cult devotion. But why place it on the forearm? Why so exposed? Yes, robes are long, but they don't sleep and eat in them 24/7. One rolled up sleeve at the wrong time, and someone sees it, and then no mask will save you. Number 6. Dementors, the unused weapon. When the Dementors, creatures that feed on joy and hope, joined Voldemort, it seemed like the end. Who could face them besides a skilled Patronus caster? And yet, where were they? Why did Death Eaters almost never bring them along? Even a pair of Dementors could crush enemy morale before the battle began. Dolores Umbridge had them around and cast a Patronus to keep them at bay. Why couldn't Death Eaters do the same? They had fear incarnate at their disposal, and barely used it. Number 7. Women among the Death Eaters. Bellatrix Lestrange wasn't just a Death Eater, she was a storm. Wild, cruel, laughing at torture. "I killed Sirius Black!" she screamed across the crumbling halls of the Department of Mysteries, her voice full of joy. She was Voldemort's most visible female follower, but also the only one truly remembered. Why? Surely she wasn't alone in her devotion. What about the other women in the pure blood circles? Where were they in this war of blood and fear? Narcissa Malfoy was not marked, but she played her part. She lied to the Dark Lord. She walked through fire for her son. "He's alive," she whispered to Harry, and in that moment she saved everything. She wasn't loyal to Voldemort. She was loyal to family, to survival. And that difference mattered. It made her dangerous in a quiet, controlled way, a different kind of strength. Yet Voldemort never valued it. He let her stand silent in the corner, watching, waiting. There were no female generals, no squads led by witches in black, no young girl Death Eaters rising through the ranks. Either Voldemort didn't trust women, or the books chose not to show them. But imagine if there had been more like Bellatrix, more cunning, powerful witches who wore the mask not out of madness, but purpose. The war would have looked very different, and maybe, just maybe, the outcome too. Number 8. Loyalty or fear. Lucius Malfoy trembled when Voldemort entered his home. His eyes never met the Dark Lord's. His voice faltered. "My lord." "We did not know. We meant no disrespect," he stammered, as Voldemort casually took his wand, his pride, and his power. Lucius wasn't loyal, he was terrified, and he wasn't alone. The other Death Eaters watched in silence, their fear thicker than any spell. They bowed not out of devotion, but survival. Bellatrix Lestrange was the exception, not the rule. "The Dark Lord lives inside me," she screamed, in the Department of Mysteries, wild with belief. But compare her to Crabbe and Goyle's fathers, silent brutes in masks, loyal only when ordered, or to the Snatchers, low-level thugs who joined because it paid well and spared their lives. There was no brotherhood, no ideology, just hierarchy and terror. And when Voldemort vanished, so did their purpose. A true army fights on without a leader. The Death Eaters did not. The moment Harry defeated Voldemort, the masks fell. No underground resistance, no martyrdom, just silence and surrender, because fear builds walls, not roots. And when the wind changed, their loyalty crumbled like dust. Number 9. The money question. Lucius Malfoy walked through the Ministry in polished boots and dragon-hide gloves. He didn't need to threaten anyone. His money spoke first. "You have been warned, Lucius," Arthur Weasley once told him in the Chamber of Secrets. But Lucius never feared warnings. He bought silence. He bought power. The Malfoys had wealth older than the Ministry itself. And that wealth didn't disappear when Voldemort returned. It became a weapon. We never see the gold behind the curses, but it's there. Someone paid for the illegal portkeys, the black market wands, the hidden safe houses. Someone funneled galleons into bribes for corrupt officials. When Death Eaters broke into Gringotts, they knew exactly which vault to target. Bellatrix's vault held more than treasure. It held trust. Who funded the takeover of Azkaban? Who supplied the Inferi? These things don't conjure themselves. Magic can kill, but gold controls. Voldemort may have despised gold, but he used it. He let Lucius fund the Ministry infiltration. He let wealthy families host gatherings and spread propaganda. And yet the story never explores the money trail. The war is told in spells and screams, but not in vaults and ledgers. That silence is deafening, because behind every war there's someone signing the checks. And in the world of Death Eaters, the Malfoys were always holding the pen. Number 10. What happened to their families? Draco. Malfoy never asked for war, but war came anyway, into his home, into his school, into his name. In Half-Blood Prince, he trembles in front of Dumbledore. "I have to do this. He'll kill me," Draco says, wand shaking. He's not a villain. He's a boy caught in the wreckage of his father's choices. Lucius joined Voldemort. Narcissa kept quiet. Draco was left to carry the weight. The dark mark never touched his skin, but it hung above his head every day. Other children must have lived the same way. Theodore Nott, son of a known Death Eater, sat quietly in the Slytherin common room, watching the storm rise. No trials for him, no headlines, just whispers and suspicion. Were these children interrogated, watched, forgotten? The Ministry of Magic hunted down the Death Eaters, but what did it do for their sons and daughters? Nothing. No protection. No guidance. Just silence. And silence is dangerous. The next war doesn't start with wands, it starts with wounds left to rot. The wizarding world let an entire generation grow up in the shadows of guilt and fear. Not everyone who carried a Death Eater's blood chose darkness, but no one reached out to show them light. Number 11, their awkward secrecy. At Malfoy Manor, Voldemort sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his Death Eaters. Snape, Bellatrix, Yaxley, all present, all watching the slow death of Charity Burbage as Nagini slithered closer. "Dinner," he whispered. It was theatrical, but it was also reckless. Gathering the entire leadership in one place created a single, perfect target. If the Order had found that location, one cursed fireball could have ended the war in an instant. Voldemort wasn't hiding. He was performing. The most dangerous man in the world appeared in person, again and again, at the Ministry, at Malfoy Manor, at Hogwarts. He trusted no one to deliver his orders. "Only I can live forever," he said, but that arrogance became his weakness. No decoys, no layers of command, just him, the center of the web. He had survived once, and he thought he would again, but the smarter tyrants stay in the shadows. Voldemort walked through them, daring someone to strike. Even the Death Eaters mirrored his blindness. Travers stormed through the Department of Magic like a hammer. The Carrows tortured children in plain sight. None of them took precautions, no coded messages, no magical disguises. It was all intimidation, all noise. Their fear of Voldemort overpowered their fear of exposure, and that, more than any spell, doomed them all. Number 12, where did new Death Eaters come from? Voldemort disappeared in 1981. 13 years later, he returned. Scarred, snake-like, but alive. The strange part wasn't just his survival, it was how quickly he rebuilt an army. Within months, his followers were back in place. Azkaban prisoners broke free. The Ministry trembled. But where did these new Death Eaters come from? The old ones, like Lucius Malfoy, had claimed they were bewitched. Many had families, reputations. They had everything to lose, yet they rejoined him without hesitation. Then came the new faces, Thorfinn Rowell, Jugson, Yaxley, names barely mentioned before, suddenly standing side by side with Bellatrix. They weren't students of the First War, they were younger, hungrier. Were they drawn in by fear or by promise? Voldemort offered no gold, no land, only power and ideology. "There is no good and evil," he once told Harry. "There is only power, and those too weak to seek it." Perhaps these recruits believed that, or perhaps they had nowhere else to go. There's no record of Voldemort building a network while in hiding. No secret Death Eater school, no visible signs of recruitment, but when he returned, the doors were already open. Could there have been a hidden society, one that whispered his name through generations? A second layer of the magical world that believed in blood purity long before he rose? If so, why did it vanish after his death, leaving no trace, no books, no leaders, no resistance? The silence is louder than the spells. We know Hogwarts taught defense, not sedition. So who trained the new Death Eaters? Who taught them unforgivable curses? They fought like soldiers. They killed without hesitation. No student leaves school like that. Someone trained them, someone prepared them, but we never learn who. We only see the smoke they left behind. Number 13. Why didn't they use the unforgivable curses more effectively? Death Eaters had no moral limits. They cast the unforgivable curses without hesitation, and yet they failed to use them with any real strategy. The Imperious Curse, for example, was powerful enough to turn anyone into a puppet. But where was the army of enslaved ministry officials? Why didn't they control the heads of Hogwarts houses or the entire Pig Wizengamot? Even Barty Crouch Jr. used Imperious on his own father and broke into Hogwarts disguised as Mad Eye Moody. It worked flawlessly for a year, and still no one else thought to do the same. The Cruciatus Curse was another missed weapon. Bellatrix Lestrange used it with pleasure, torturing Alice and Frank Longbottom into insanity. "You need to mean it, Potter," she said in the Department of Mysteries, laughing while Harry failed to cast it properly. And yet, when it came to interrogation, most Death Eaters didn't use it. They relied on threats, brute force, or Dementors. But not Cruciatus. Why? They had the legal freedom under Voldemort's regime. They had the victims. But somehow they hesitated, as if even they feared the spell's cost. Azkaban's guards could have fallen under Imperious. So could the Unspeakables, the Cursebreakers at Gringotts, even Arthur Weasley. Imagine if Percy, the obedient son, had been placed under the curse and used to spy on his family. No one would have suspected it until it was too late. But no, instead, Death Eaters preferred open duels and flashy raids. Their war felt loud and theatrical, not surgical or intelligent. Voldemort prided himself on fear and dominance, but fear alone isn't enough. His followers had the most dangerous spells in the magical world at their fingertips. Still, they used them like children with fireworks, wild, showy, and often too late. It wasn't about lack of power, it was about lack of vision. Their greatest tools were never used to their full potential, and that, perhaps, was their greatest mistake. Number 14. Where were their headquarters? There was a grim grandeur to Malfoy Manor, a place of polished marble and ancestral pride, nestled in the Wiltshire countryside. It was here, during the Second Wizarding War, that Voldemort chose to base his operations, a curious choice considering the vastness of his ambitions. The Dark Lord, who sought dominion over all of wizardkind, ruled from a single opulent dining room. One long table, one coiled serpent, one house-turned fortress, but the question lingers like the faint scent of decay in a forgotten corridor. Where else did the Death Eaters go? Could a war led by such a calculating mind truly rest on a single location? Well, the answer, for many fans, appears unsatisfyingly simple. Malfoy Manor is indeed the only documented headquarters of the Death Eaters during Voldemort's second rise. Yet the very nature of their organization, a group that thrived on fear, secrecy, and covert manipulation, suggests there had to be more. A single estate, however secure, would have been a strategic vulnerability. The Order of the Phoenix had their number 12, grim old place, protected by the Fidelius charm, and even they weren't reckless enough to rely on just one place. Why then did Voldemort, with his unmatched skill in the dark arts, not construct a complex web of hideouts? Beneath the surface of the official narrative, there are hints, wisps of shadow, clinging to the corners of canon. Consider the moment in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, when Severus Snape makes the unbreakable vow with Narcissa Malfoy. The scene does not occur at Malfoy Manor, but in Snape's own home, Spinner's End. Though not a Death Eater base per se, it suggests a network of private residences used for operations, free from surveillance. Voldemort valued discretion. He would never have massed his forces in one place without contingency. Spinner's End, a squalid, half-abandoned Muggle neighborhood, offered perfect camouflage, a testament to the idea that not all Death Eater operations required grandeur. Take also the Riddle House in Little Hangleton, where Voldemort returned before the Triwizard Tournament. This location, abandoned and decrepit, bore the weight of familial murder and magical residue. Though it served as a temporary refuge in the Goblet of Fire, it's telling that the Death Eaters knew to meet there. The meeting in the graveyard was not spontaneous. It followed a planned resurrection, and they knew where to gather. Bellatrix Lestrange, Lucius Malfoy, McNair, Crabbe, Goyle, Nott. They all appeared, apparating in ominous synchrony. That suggests a communication system, and more importantly that there were pre-designated gathering points known to the inner circle. In truth, the Death Eaters may have functioned more like a network of autonomous cells than a militarized, centralized army. Think of how Lucius Malfoy operated within the Ministry. Think of how Yaxley rose through its ranks. Think of Dolores Umbridge's questionable ties to their ideology. If one needed evidence that Voldemort's army preferred to infest the system from within rather than mount conventional campaigns, it is found in these individual placements. Their base was not brick and stone, their base was corruption itself. The Ministry of Magic, under the Imperious Curse and infiltration, became a de facto base of operations. No secret map could point to it, but its corridors echoed with Voldemort's will. Still whispers persist of places untouched by canon, ghost towns of loyalty hidden in the pages we never turned. In Romania, near the Carpathian Mountains, local folklore tells of a cloaked man who paid handsomely in galleons and blood to establish a manor deep in the forest. The Romanians know him as the Whisperer, and though his name is lost to time, some say he was among those who vanished after Voldemort's fall. Was this a rogue Death Eater, or a sentry post far from the Ministry's reach? The Department of International Magical Cooperation dismissed it as superstition, but whispers travel faster than owls. The Gaunt Shack, too, offers a chilling case study. Isolated in the woods near Little Hangleton, it was the birthplace of Voldemort's legacy of hatred. The shack saw no meetings during the war, but its symbolic value, housing the Ring of the Peverils, later a Horcrux, meant it held weight in Voldemort's narrative. It is entirely plausible that lesser Death Eaters, craving spiritual proximity to their master's roots, used the shack as a site for ritual gatherings. The Fidelius charm, with a willing secret keeper, could have rendered such places invisible to the Ministry, and if that secret keeper perished, the location would die with him like so many secrets. Then there are the Nocturne Alley outposts. Borgin and Burke's was a haven for dark objects, yes, but it was also a meeting ground. Draco Malfoy's visit in The Half-Blood Prince wasn't just about the Vanishing Cabinet. It was a demonstration of familiarity. This wasn't foreign soil to him. It was an extension of his world, a realm where dangerous alliances were born in the back room over poisoned goblets and cursed trinkets. In that light, Nocturne Alley may have functioned as an underground relay station, cloaked in legality, bathed in shadow. The Death Eaters were also known to have made temporary use of Hogwarts itself. In the Deathly Hallows, once Snape assumed the role of headmaster, Hogwarts became an occupied territory. Carrow's siblings taught dark arts. Dissenters were punished. Neville Longbottom bore the scars of their regime. Though not a base in the traditional sense, it served as a crucial holding, a symbol turned weapon. Its corridors heard the chants of torture, not education. Voldemort had seized the heart of magical Britain, and for a time that heart beat with his name. Number 15, why didn't they forge documents and artifacts? The Death Eaters prided themselves on fear. Every appearance, every raid, every murder was carefully crafted to showcase domination through power. They didn't slink in the shadows forging ministry documents or manipulating bureaucracy. They kicked down doors, spread the dark mark, and vanished before anyone could react. It was a brutal kind of theatre. What's curious, though, is how little they relied on deception, true deception, in the form of forgery or strategic manipulation. In a world overflowing with magical means of disguise, illusion, and falsification, the Death Eaters clung to physical violence like zealots. They could have created fake decrees from the Minister of Magic. They could have slipped in doctored prophecy records, enchanted objects laced with lies, but they didn't. They rarely, if ever, tried to deceive with subtlety. When the trio infiltrated the Ministry in Deathly Hallows, they found the institution rotting from within, but not because of clever magical forgeries. Instead, the Death Eaters had simply seized control and rewritten the rules publicly. Umbridge wore the locket of Slytherin not as part of a secret plan, but as a symbol of entitlement and propaganda. She handed out pamphlets and interrogation orders like a dictator, not a con artist. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. The whole regime was a hammer, not a scalpel. One would imagine that such a powerful group, backed by centuries-old bloodlines, would at least try more refined tactics. The magical world had plenty of means. A simple confundus charm could convince a low-level ministry employee that a dangerous order was authentic. A well-placed Mimblewimble could silence a witness permanently without spilling blood. But Voldemort's followers preferred brute force. Even during their most covert missions, like the infiltration of the Department of Mysteries to recover the prophecy, they relied on overwhelming violence and sheer numbers, not illusion or subterfuge. The attack on the Quidditch World Cup stands as a rare moment of chaos orchestrated without murder, but even there, it wasn't manipulation, it was a display. They sent the message that they could appear anywhere, torch the sky with the dark mark, and vanish. It was spectacle, not strategy. The terror lay in the exposure, in being seen and feared. Not once during that night was there a whispered rumor of documents forged or identities stolen. It was all fire and masks. Voldemort's own return shows the same paradox. After the Triwizard Tournament, the Dark Lord could have worked in secret to destabilize the Ministry, releasing fake reports, distorting prophecy archives, or feeding misinformation through charmed letters. But he didn't. His method was to make Dumbledore look like a madman and Harry a liar. The lie wasn't clever, it was institutional denial, not magical forgery. Fudge refused to believe because he was weak, not because Voldemort planted fake evidence. The opportunity was there, but Voldemort didn't take it. This strategic shortfall reveals more about Voldemort than about his followers. Tom Riddle, the student who once charmed Slughorn and convinced Dumbledore of his innocence, was capable of deceit. He fooled Hepzibah Smith into showing him her treasured heirlooms. He murdered her, stole the locket and cup, and erased all traces. He was once a master of the quiet, invisible crime, but after his resurrection, he abandoned that side of himself. He no longer needed charm. He believed that fear alone could win wars. It's tempting to believe this was a deliberate choice, a philosophy. To Voldemort, subtlety may have seemed weak. He scoffed at Dumbledore's belief in love and inner strength. His ideology was rooted in domination, not persuasion. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore tells Harry, "You are protected, in short, by your ability to love, the only protection that can possibly work against the lure of power like Voldemort's. If Voldemort rejected love, perhaps he also rejected cunning that wasn't anchored in power." Even during the fall of the Ministry, we see no evidence that the Death Eaters used forgeries to rewrite the bureaucracy quietly. They replaced Kingsley and others with loyalists, captured Muggleborns through the Muggleborn Registration Commission, and openly patrolled the streets. They could have created fake safe zones, published false decrees, tricked the Order into walking into traps. But instead they simply hunted. Snatchers roamed the countryside not with illusions, but with physical force. Consider also the capture of Xenophilius Lovegood. The Death Eaters didn't impersonate Luna's school officials to summon her quietly. They just took her. When Harry visited Xenophilius, the man betrayed them out of fear, but not because he was tricked with a forged summons or cursed message. Again, brute pressure, not magical misdirection, defined their methods. And when Harry, Ron, and Hermione were finally caught by Snatchers, the confrontation was clumsy and violent, lacking even basic magical disguises. Why didn't Bellatrix Lestrange forge documents to escape Azkaban? A woman of her intelligence, with access to ancient spells and family resources, could have conjured a magical trail of deception. But no, she waited until a mass breakout engineered by brute force under Voldemort's growing shadow. Her style was violence, loyalty, and madness, not manipulation. She believed in Voldemort's doctrine of domination, and she embodied it completely. This rejection of illusion is deeply ironic in a world that thrives on magical disguise. Polyjuice potion, for example, is widely used by those outside the Death Eater circle. Barty Crouch Jr., while a Death Eater, acted independently when impersonating Mad-Eye Moody. He succeeded because of cunning, secrecy, and perfect mimicry, but even then his success came while operating away from the inner circle of the Death Eaters. His method, while effective, didn't become the blueprint for further operations. What's particularly telling is that Dumbledore's army, the ragtag group of schoolchildren, employed more stealth and strategy than the Death Eaters. They used the enchanted coin system to organize meetings. They practiced in the Room of Requirement, hidden by ancient enchantments. Their secrecy protected them longer than brute force could have. That the children outmaneuvered the Dark Lord's army by being smarter, not stronger, says much about the latter's strategic limitations. Number 16. Where did they learn all this dark magic? Bellatrix. Lestrange didn't just learn the Cruciatus Curse by watching someone else use it. She mastered it. Her curse could unmake a mind in seconds, as it did with Alice and Frank Longbottom. To perform unforgivable curses so powerfully with such consistency demands more than anger or hatred. It demands education, repetition, perhaps even mentorship. Bellatrix was born into the House of Black, yes, where dark traditions were whispered across mahogany tables. But tradition alone doesn't explain how she resisted Azkaban's mind-breaking despair for over a decade, or how she fought duels with some of the most skilled Aurors, and survived. She knew more than what Hogwarts taught in the Defense Against the Dark Arts curriculum. She knew how to break people. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. Hogwarts, for all its majestic corridors and ancient secrets, never intended to teach its students how to dominate minds or tear souls apart. There were no textbooks in the restricted section that taught human transmutation or ritual sacrifice. Even Horace Slughorn, who taught many Death Eaters in Slytherin House, drew the line at ambition. "You mustn't think I condone what Tom became," he once told Harry. Slughorn's idea of pushing limits was brewing Felix Felicis, not binding inferi to eternal servitude. So where did Lucius Malfoy learn the subtle hexes that took down members of the Wizengamot during the First Wizarding War? Who taught Evan Rosier the explosive spells that required Alastair Moody to sacrifice half his face to survive? Consider Severus Snape. Though he ultimately defected from Voldemort's cause, he was a Death Eater, and a particularly dangerous one. He created spells like Sectum Sempra while still a teenager. He filled the margins of his textbooks with dangerous annotations, improvements on the work of masters. If even one Death Eater could invent spells as cruel and effective as Leviculus and Langlock, who's to say he was alone in this? The creation of new magic is not a casual hobby. It's an art form that requires experimentation, libraries, and guidance. Either Snape was a singular genius, or the Death Eaters operated a system that cultivated magical innovation with malicious purpose. Then there's the question of resilience. Death Eaters were often tortured by Voldemort himself, subjected to mental domination and pain, yet they did not break. They returned, they obeyed. Some, like Barty Crouch Jr., remained loyal even after years of Azkaban. He withstood Dementors and plotted a return, not merely surviving but outwitting the Ministry by impersonating Mad-Eye Moody for an entire school year. Where did he learn that level of magical control, such mastery over Polyjuice potion, voice modulation, and wand concealment? That wasn't in any seventh-year syllabus. That was advanced magic, and the kind that requires rigorous training and access to dark knowledge. Peter Pettigrew, the most underestimated among them, was no exception. Once mocked as weak and pitiful, Wormtail nonetheless performed a blood ritual powerful enough to restore Voldemort's body. He brewed a potion that combined bone of the father, flesh of the servant, and blood of the enemy. Even Snape was astonished by its success. The ritual produced a new, stronger, dark lord. This wasn't clumsy improvisation, it was precise dark alchemy. Pettigrew's skills had clearly evolved during his time with the scattered Death Eaters. Someone taught him. Someone gave him access to knowledge far beyond what Flitwick or Sprout ever offered. The most disturbing implication is not that Voldemort's followers were violent, that much is obvious, but that they were organized. These were not scattered rebels dabbling in forbidden curses. They had infrastructure. It is almost certain that Voldemort, meticulous, paranoid, and obsessed with control, developed a shadow curriculum. He would not rely on incompetence. He required disciples who could fight, infiltrate, and corrupt from within. And he, being a perfectionist, would ensure their education. One wonders, did they meet in hidden chambers beneath Malfoy Manor? Did they study forbidden scrolls recovered from the ruins of Nurmengard? Were they trained by ancient spirits, or instructed by exiled dark wizards from Durmstrang? Durmstrang itself is worth mentioning. Though not all Death Eaters were alumni, Durmstrang had a reputation for tolerating, even encouraging, dark arts. Gellert Grindelwald studied there. Its curriculum permitted experimentation with hexes and dark rituals. It is not unlikely that Voldemort sent some of his young recruits to such places or brought instructors from them into his fold. Perhaps there were seminars, secret gatherings, or what Muggle criminals might call training camps, and unlike Hogwarts, there would be no ministry oversight, no interfering headmasters. Voldemort's recruits would be tested not on essays or arbibules, but on obedience, cruelty, and precision under pressure. Let us look at the Carrows. Alecto and Amicus were brutish, yes, but they had a level of magical prowess that allowed them to become professors at Hogwarts during the Death Eater occupation. Amicus taught the dark arts, not defense against it, and did so with institutional backing. Alecto taught Muggle studies in a way that promoted hatred and violence. They used their authority to train the next generation of Voldemort's followers. That brief period, during the Second Wizarding War, was a glimpse into how Voldemort would have built his school, had he won. It is likely that what we saw at Hogwarts was a copy of what had already existed in secret, a pedagogy of pain and power. There are whispers of locations, of course. The Riddle House, long abandoned, was said to contain a hidden chamber where Voldemort meditated and performed rituals. Malfoy Manor was a known meeting point, but what about the ruins of Little Hangleton or the forest near Albania where Voldemort lingered as a wraith? These places could have hidden tomes, objects, or relics used to instruct new recruits. It's possible that Voldemort employed pensieves, allowing his followers to experience torture spells or occlumency barriers firsthand. Such memory-based education would be far more effective than written instruction, and Voldemort had access to such magic. Number 17. What happened to them after the war? After the Battle of Hogwarts, while the castle still echoed with the dying screams of war and the charred stones bore the weight of final sacrifice, the wizarding world stood silent, dazed, almost drunk on the relief of Voldemort's death. But beneath that relief, in the shadowed corners of the Great Hall and the smoking ruins of the Forbidden Forest, a question went unspoken. A question that now, years later, chills the spine of those who dare ask it. What became of the Death Eaters who survived? Not the ones whose corpses lay sprawled beside their Dark Lord, not the ones kissed by Dementors in Azkaban, but those who vanished in the confusion, slipping through the cracks of a world too eager to forget. Many remember the dramatic ends, Bellatrix Lestrange struck down by Molly Weasley in a fury that shook the Great Hall. Antonin Dolohov, already half-mad from years in Azkaban, torn apart by curses. Crabbe, lost to his own fiend fire. But the real danger, the quiet rot, came from those who escaped justice. Take Walden McNair, for instance, the executioner with a taste for blood, who relished every order Voldemort gave. After the battle, nobody was ever found. Rumours claimed he was seen fleeing through the Forbidden Forest, his executioner's axe still clenched in hand, his eyes wide, not with fear, but fury. The ministry claimed he had been presumed dead, but no trace was ever recovered. No wand, no blood, no bones. Not every Death Eater had the dark mark branded so publicly that they could not hide. Many, like Selwyn or Jugson, simply melted into the background. They had learned, from the first fall of the Dark Lord, learned that justice in the wizarding world was a theatre, not a blade. Just as Lucius Malfoy had claimed the Imperious Curse after Voldemort's first defeat, so too did many now adopt the language of victims. And the ministry, fractured and reeling, chose stability over vengeance. Avery, who had long been a coward in Voldemort's service, was never even brought to trial. His family, old money, and older connections moved quickly, planting stories of coercion and fear. He was never truly one of them, the whispers went. But Harry remembered Avery well, remembered how his face twisted in glee during raids, remembered how he had cheered when children were tortured at the hands of Carrow. Avery now lived under a different name, somewhere in Wales, teaching potions in a minor magical academy. No official record tied him to the war, no punishment was ever delivered. And what of those like Alecto and Amicus Carrow, whose lessons at Hogwarts had left more scars than education? While they were imprisoned, whispers suggested that their sentences were shorter than expected. Kingsley Shacklebolt, rising to power in a ministry desperate for reform, believed in healing, in moving forward, but in that forward rush many truths were swept aside. It is said the Carrows were released quietly after a few years, deemed no longer a threat. But fear is not measured by prison time, and darkness does not decay so easily. Perhaps the most chilling example is Corbin Yaxley. A senior official at the ministry during Voldemort's takeover, Yaxley had been embedded deep in the bureaucratic machinery. His knowledge of magical law, curses, and influence made him invaluable, not just to Voldemort, but to those who came after. When the Dark Lord fell, Yaxley vanished. The ministry declared him a fugitive, but 2 years later an anonymous source revealed that a man bearing Yaxley's appearance had been seen entering a vault in Gringotts. A vault untouched by war, shielded by generations of secrecy. The goblins, citing client confidentiality, refused to investigate. His face was never seen again. There are darker rumours too, ones that never made the prophet's pages. In Nocturne Alley, old vendors speak of masked men who appear during the thinning of the veil in October, men who buy cursed relics and speak in parcel tongue. In Albania, an old hag claims that she saw a pale wizard in silver robes sacrifice a unicorn. In South America, a tribe of wizards whispered of a man who called himself the Scourge and bore a tattoo like a serpent strangling the moon, a variation of the dark mark. There is a truth here that no one wants to speak aloud, that not all the Death Eaters were fools or fanatics. Some were tacticians, some were quiet, cunning men and women who never raised a wand in public but wrote the policies, passed the laws, orchestrated the purges behind closed doors. Dolohov may have killed, but others planned the infrastructure of terror. Those men were never caught because they never let their names be known. They wore masks not just in battle, but in court, in ministry halls, in society. And what of the younger ones? The boys and girls who had followed Draco Malfoy down dark paths, who cheered when Muggleborns were whipped in the corridors of Hogwarts. Some, like Theodore Nott, disappeared entirely. Others, like Daphne Greengrass, simply re-entered high society. The world was too eager to pretend they had been children, incapable of guilt, but some had blood on their wands. Harry had once seen a 13-year-old boy named Thorfinn throw a hex that left a Ravenclaw student in a coma. That boy was never charged. He now owns a successful wand shop in France. Voldemort may have died, but his legacy was a living organism, feeding on denial. No grand trials were held, no magical version of Nuremberg. Kingsley, in his desire to preserve peace, outlawed witch hunts. But in doing so, the truth was buried. Harry himself, weary from war, refused to lead a crusade. "I'm not interested in vengeance," he said once in a rare interview. "I'm interested in peace. But peace bought at the cost of silence is a peace that sleeps on a bed of bones." Neville Longbottom, years later, confided to Luna that he still saw Electo Carrow in his nightmares. "Sometimes," he said, "I wonder if I'd recognize her if she walked past me. What if she's living in Hogsmeade? What if she's free, laughing at me in the crowd?" Luna, ever the seeker of hidden truths, once suggested that an underground network of former Death Eaters was still active. She believed they used magical disguises and a series of enchanted mirrors to communicate across continents. No one took her seriously, but Luna had seen too much not to notice patterns. Even in the hallowed walls of Hogwarts, the ghosts lingered. Students would sometimes speak of strange symbols found carved into stone behind old tapestries, serpents coiled around skulls, eyes that bled ink. Once, in 2011, a professor found a diary hidden in a suit of armour. It was not a Horcrux, but it bore terrifying entries. "We wait," one line read. "We remember. We return." The handwriting was delicate, female, but the name was unknown. There are those who argue that these stories are just that. Stories. That the war ended and the world healed. But even Hermione Granger, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, once admitted in a private letter, "Too many disappeared, too many walked free. I fear the seeds are still buried, waiting for another storm." Her reforms focused on Muggle-born rights and transparency, but she too faced political resistance when attempting to open files from the war years. "Let the dead stay dead," one ministry official told her. But the dead do not stay dead in the wizarding world. Portraits whisper, pensives remember, and dark artifacts hold memories no magic can erase. In 2015, a young curse-breaker named Alaric Fawley vanished during an expedition to a ruined estate once belonging to the Lestranges. His last journal entry described a gathering, masked figures chanting, and a voice that claimed to serve the true heir. No further details were ever found. The ministry classified it as death by trap curse. His body was never recovered. Even among the Aurors there was unease. Some spoke of being followed during assignments, of hearing old names muttered on the wind. An Auror named Sepha Blackstone disappeared for 3 days in 2016, returning with her mind shattered. She whispered again and again, "He's not gone, he's waiting." She died 6 months later, unable to cast even the simplest lumos. Her wand had snapped in two, though no one knew how. And then there's the chilling fact that in 2019, during a registry update for magical families, it was discovered that over 200 wand signatures from the war had never been deactivated. These wands, all known to belong to Death Eaters, had not cast spells registered by the ministry in years, but neither had they been confirmed destroyed. Where were they? Who held them now? The files were quietly sealed. So many were never held accountable. Travers, Gibbon, Rookwood, Selwyn. Names like poison in the blood, once whispered in fear, now forgotten by a generation that never saw the sky darken with the Mors Mordre. But forgetting is dangerous, for evil does not die in battle. It sleeps, burrows, evolves. Perhaps one day, these nameless, untried Death Eaters will gather again, not with banners and snakes, but with smiles and handshakes, entering through doors left open by memory's erosion. And if they do, who will remember their crimes? Who will name them? Who will stand against them when the heroes of the last war grow old and their scars fade into history books? The Death Eaters are not gone, they are merely waiting. Number 18, why didn't they take over Hogwarts earlier? Of all the enigmatic decisions Voldemort made during his ascent to power, one question continues to haunt readers long after the final battle. Why didn't the Death Eaters seize Hogwarts earlier? For a group so bent on domination and control, bypassing the single most strategically vital place in the wizarding world appears almost absurd. Hogwarts was not just a school, it was a fortress, a bastion of knowledge, a training ground for future witches and wizards, and above all, the one place Albus Dumbledore called home. Every thread of resistance against the Dark Lord seemed to converge there. Yet instead of laying siege to it early, Voldemort chose to bide his time, inserting spies, manipulating events from afar, and waiting until the final year when the battle lines had already been drawn too deep. The heart of the mystery lies in Hogwarts' symbolic and magical weight. Voldemort, despite his arrogance, understood the school's ancient power. It wasn't simply four walls and enchanted ceilings. It was enchanted with thousands of years of layered protections. Not only were there magical defenses, but the castle itself had a will of its own, choosing who could enter, what it would reveal, and when it would awaken its hidden weapons. Voldemort, obsessed with control, had no patience for unpredictability, and Hogwarts was deeply unpredictable. Even Voldemort fears those who dwell here, Dumbledore once said, as recorded in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. The castle was not his to claim lightly. Strategically, Voldemort may have believed that Dumbledore's presence made Hogwarts impenetrable. The headmaster was the only wizard he had ever truly feared. To attack the school while Dumbledore was alive would have meant facing not only a master of magic, but one protected by loyalty, deep-rooted traditions, and a faculty trained to fight. Dumbledore had the loyalty of the centaurs in the Forbidden Forest, the respect of the house elves, the trust of the ghosts, and the allegiance of the Order of the Phoenix. A direct assault would not have just risked failure, it would have exposed weakness. Instead, Voldemort played a longer game, inserting Severus Snape as a double agent. This move alone shows the depth of Voldemort's caution. If he truly believed himself invincible, he would have stormed the castle. Instead, he relied on subterfuge. Snape's appointment to the staff allowed the Death Eaters a window into Hogwarts' inner workings. But even then, Snape's loyalty remained ambiguous, a chess piece moved by multiple hands. He protected the students more than he harmed them, and his presence never fully tilted the school toward the dark. Another subtle insertion was Draco Malfoy. Chosen not for his skill but his bloodline, Draco's mission to kill Dumbledore was doomed from the beginning. It wasn't meant to succeed, it was a test, a slow corrosion of the school's defenses through internal sabotage. The cabinet hidden in the Room of Requirement, the poisoned mead, the cursed necklace, each a whisper of the chaos to come. But even these attacks were quiet, half-hearted, sabotaged by guilt and hesitation. Hogwarts refused to turn into a battlefield until the time was ripe. And time, for Voldemort, was always a tool. He wanted Hogwarts not through war, but through erosion. He wanted the students to fear their mentors, the professors to doubt their loyalties, and the Order to be stretched thin across a dozen fronts. When the Ministry fell, he believed the school would follow like a house of cards. It did not. Instead, it grew louder in its defiance. Students formed Dumbledore's army again. Neville Longbottom, Luna Lovegood, and Ginny Weasley turned the Room of Requirement into a hidden base of resistance. They did this not because Hogwarts fell, but because it didn't. The timing of the actual takeover is telling. Only after Dumbledore's death and the Ministry's collapse did the Death Eaters dare claim Hogwarts. They installed Snape as headmaster and a pair of Carrows to enforce their ideology through fear and torture. But by then, it was too late. Hogwarts was no longer a neutral ground, it was openly rebellious. The students had already been taught how to fight. Harry's influence had left behind a burning imprint. The very idea of Voldemort's control became something to mock, to resist. The castle might have been theirs by title, but never by spirit. Ironically, Voldemort's delay allowed Hogwarts to become the single, strongest point of resistance. The very thing he tried to avoid, a student rebellion, flourished in his absence. He had hoped to instill fear by waiting until he could claim the school with ease. Instead, he allowed Dumbledore's ideals to root deeper. Professor McGonagall, once a stern figure of order, transformed into a general of the resistance. The portraits of past headmasters whispered warnings. The castle itself awakened its ancient defences. "Hogwarts is threatened!" shouted the guardian stone statues in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, rising to defend the school alongside the living. Had Voldemort taken the school early, he could have rewritten its curriculum. He could have raised children to believe in blood purity, to distrust Muggle-borns, to worship his name as a saviour of magical tradition. Imagine the psychological power of such indoctrination. Instead, he left the next generation to the guidance of professors who believed in choice, kindness, and rebellion. The Carrows attempted forced teaching, but the students mocked them. They didn't fear them. They sabotaged them from within. It is also worth noting that Voldemort was obsessed with immortality, not education. He never saw Hogwarts as a tool for the future. He saw it as a relic of his past, a place that had both shaped him and rejected him. He hated Dumbledore for not recognizing his potential, for offering redemption instead of worship. Hogwarts was a wound, not a prize, and so he ignored it, underestimated it, resented it. In doing so, he let it become the heart of his undoing. In his final year, when he finally sent his army, the castle responded with fury. The statues marched, the suits of armor fought, the ghosts rallied. The Room of Requirement became a weapon. Even the Slytherin students, long accused of loyalty to the dark, hesitated. Not all left. Some stayed, some fought. That complexity, that refusal to be reduced to sides made Hogwarts dangerous. It was never just a school, it was a mirror of the magical world, and Voldemort, in his arrogance, thought he could control that reflection with force alone. There's also the matter of magical laws. The castle had enchantments that refused entry to those who meant harm. During earlier years, even Dumbledore had to negotiate with the castle's protections. When Umbridge tried to seize control through the Ministry, the very walls resisted. "She can't fire me," Dumbledore told her. "You do not have the authority to banish me from this place." Not even the Ministry could fully claim it. For Voldemort, who often dismissed rules, magical or otherwise, Hogwarts' autonomous protections were a problem he couldn't solve with brute power. By the time he placed Nagini in the Shrieking Shack, the war had turned. Hogwarts was no longer a target, it was a battlefield, and even then Voldemort refused to enter the castle until he thought Harry was dead. He feared the place, not for its stones or spells, but for what it represented: loyalty, resilience, community, and above all, hope. He never understood these things, and thus he could never defeat them. When Snape was murdered for the Elder Wand, it wasn't strategy, it was paranoia. Voldemort misread loyalty as weakness. He believed that possessing the wand would bend Hogwarts to his will, but the wand, like the school, did not answer to fear. It answered to allegiance, to earned power, not stolen thunder. Harry, having once disarmed Draco, held the true ownership, and Hogwarts, the castle that had seen centuries of bloodshed and betrayal, gave its strength not to the conqueror, but to the boy who had grown up in its halls. Throughout the series, Hogwarts acted as more than a setting. It was a character, one that watched, reacted, resisted. Voldemort, who sought to rewrite history, found that some histories could not be erased. The Founder's magic lingered. The Sorting Hat refused to obey tyranny. The ghosts whispered secrets, the walls concealed truths, and beneath it all, the school's legacy of unity across differences defied every Death Eater creed. Even when the school was technically controlled by the Death Eaters, they never really ruled it. The rebellion didn't come from outside, it came from within. Students like Seamus Finnegan and Hannah Abbott, once background figures, rose as leaders. Filch, once a bitter caretaker, tried to maintain order and failed. The Carrows, intended as disciplinarians, were terrorized by children they couldn't truly understand. Neville Longbottom, a boy once mocked for clumsiness, became a symbol of defiance. It helps when people stand up to them, he said, bloodied but unbroken. Perhaps the most poetic irony is that the delay allowed Voldemort's enemies to prepare the very end he tried to avoid. The Horcrux hidden in Ravenclaw's diadem might have remained intact had the school been seized earlier, but by waiting, Voldemort allowed the pieces of his soul to be hunted from within the walls he once called home. The room of requirement which he once used for secrecy became the crucible of his ruin. It harbored the rebels, it destroyed the diadem, it gave shelter to Harry's army. In the end, Hogwarts was never conquered, it was defended from within. Voldemort saw power as something to be taken. Hogwarts taught its students that real power is earned. That was the lesson he could never learn, and that perhaps is why he lost. Number 19. Their strange relationship with Muggle technology. The Death Eaters prided themselves on their magical superiority. They saw Muggles as inferior creatures, weak, ignorant, unworthy of the magical gift. They spat on Muggle ways, scorned their cities, and rolled their eyes at Muggle inventions as though they were the toys of infants. And yet there was something disturbingly primitive about this attitude, almost suicidal in its arrogance, because while the Death Eaters could manipulate spells with deadly precision, they remained baffled by the sheer scale of what Muggle technology could do. They never learned how it worked, never tried to understand it, never considered bending it to their cause. This was not simply oversight, it was one of the deepest cracks in their ideology, and perhaps one of the most telling reasons for their ultimate failure. Lord Voldemort, for all his brilliance, his strategic cunning, his deep understanding of magical lore and fear-mongering, ruled a movement that seemed rooted in the past. His Death Eaters were, at best, medieval in their methods. They kidnapped, tortured, hexed, and murdered. They flew through the skies in smoke. They spread fear with fire and curses, but they never, even at the height of their dominance, thought to bomb a Muggle Parliament building. They never hacked a radio broadcast. They never used Muggle surveillance against the Muggles themselves. They never exploited the world they sought to control. And that wasn't just a choice, it was an ideological blindness. Bellatrix Lestrange, among Voldemort's most devoted followers, famously said, "The Dark Lord is the most powerful wizard of all time. He doesn't need tricks." And therein lay the flaw. Magic was seen as holy, pure, invincible. Anything outside of it, electricity, steel, even medicine, was tainted by its origin. It wasn't that they feared Muggle technology. They dismissed it. They viewed it with the same contempt a dragon might show a wooden fence. But arrogance, history has shown, is a poor shield. Consider, for instance, the events of 1996, when the Death Eaters successfully infiltrated the Ministry of Magic. They took control of the wizarding government, installed Pius Thicknesser as a puppet minister, and began their reign of terror. Muggleborns were hunted, interrogated, imprisoned. A propaganda campaign was launched to instill fear. And yet, despite this powerful position, no attempt was made to influence the Muggle world using Muggle means. Not one Death Eater so much as tampered with a telephone line. Not one even considered sending a virus through a computer network or poisoning a municipal water supply. It was as though they had seized an empire and then ignored half its power. Lucius Malfoy, whose influence extended into both magical and political circles, was particularly illustrative of this paradox. Here was a man with endless access to Muggle society through his wealth, his estate, his role at the ministry. He could have easily purchased a Muggle weapon, hired a Muggle technician, or even recruited a rogue soldier. But instead, he trusted entirely in magic. It wasn't practicality that guided him, it was pride. And pride, as the Greeks knew long before Rowling, invites catastrophe. There is a deeper irony in the Death Eaters' attitude when one considers how easily Muggle technology could have amplified their terror. A simple incendiary device placed in King's Cross Station, for example, would have caused not only mass panic, but also masked the disappearance of magical children heading to Hogwarts. A tampered television broadcast showing images of wizard duels or inferi on the march could have shattered Muggle confidence and plunged the UK into hysteria. And yet, such tactics were beneath them. They fought as if the world had not changed since the days of Merlin. The Death Eaters' reliance on magical means made them predictable. Aurors knew where they would strike at wizarding landmarks during magical events using magical tools. But had they adopted even a rudimentary understanding of modern weaponry, they could have become far more dangerous. What was a Protego spell against a long-range rifle? What shield charm could withstand a bomb planted beneath the floorboards? The Order of the Phoenix was lucky not because of superior numbers, but because of Death Eater short-sightedness. There is no clearer example of this blindness than during the Battle of the Seven Potters. The Death Eaters prepared an ambush in the sky, relying entirely on broomsticks, wands, and spells. It was a magical masterpiece of coordination, but had they simply set up heat-seeking missiles, radar tracking, or even a few snipers on the motorways, the battle might have ended in seconds. Instead, they flew into the night like airborne knights, throwing fire at each other, clinging to a way of war long obsolete in the world below. Even Severus Snape, who straddled the line between the magical and Muggle worlds more than any other character, rarely expressed any interest in non-magical innovation. A half-blood raised in a Muggle neighborhood, Snape would have known perfectly well how electricity worked, what radios were, what knives and bullets could do. And yet, in his Death Eater years, he never employed such knowledge, not even once. Whether through fear of discovery or personal disdain, he chose to fight on Voldemort's terms, terms that ignored the modern world entirely. This rejection of the modern wasn't just impractical, it was symbolic. The Death Eaters clung to robes and masks, spoke in archaic phrases, practiced rituals drenched in ancient symbolism. They modelled themselves after feudal warlords, not contemporary revolutionaries. Unlike Muggle-born resistance fighters in the real world, who often used whatever tools they could find to fight back, radio, guerrilla warfare, code, the Death Eaters insisted on style over efficiency. A single hacker could have done more damage to the Ministry than a dozen Cruciatus curses, but that wasn't their way, and so they lost. One could argue that Voldemort, having been raised in a Muggle orphanage, should have recognized the value of Muggle technology. He had seen radios, newspapers, hospitals. He had read Muggle books and watched Muggle reactions. But as Tom Riddle became the Dark Lord, he shed these memories like a snake's skin. Everything Muggle became, in his mind, synonymous with weakness. He did not just reject his past, he despised it. And in doing so, he refused to learn anything useful from it. During the Second Wizarding War, the Death Eaters targeted places like Diagon Alley, Hogsmeade, and the homes of known magical families. But imagine if they had attacked nuclear facilities, subway systems, or broadcasting towers. Imagine if they had released a gas into Parliament, or caused blackouts across London through magical manipulation of electrical grids. The magical world might have remained hidden, but the Muggle world would have crumbled, and with it, all hope of resistance. The moment Dumbledore's portrait uttered the words, "They have the Ministry," one would expect that Muggle London would fall soon after. But it didn't. Because the Death Eaters didn't know what to do with it. They feared Muggle crowds, not because of their guns, but because they didn't understand how to manipulate their environment. They had spells to control minds, but no concept of mass media. They had curses to destroy organs, but no knowledge of antibiotics. They had flying broomsticks, but no understanding of drones, satellites, or surveillance networks. The ultimate irony may be that their disdain for Muggle invention made them more visible, not less. A Death Eater operating in a Muggle neighborhood stood out because of their robes, their spells, their sheer refusal to blend in. Had they learned to dress in suits, use mobile phones, or move through cities without spectacle, they could have infiltrated society with terrifying ease, but they couldn't stomach the thought. Their hatred made them blind, and their blindness made them vulnerable. Even the young Death Eaters, Draco Malfoy, Vincent Crabbe, Gregory Goyle, seemed to know little of the world outside Hogwarts. Draco, with his access to the Muggleborns at school, showed no signs of curiosity or experimentation. He didn't ask how telephones worked. He never snuck into a Muggle cinema. The bubble was complete, and Voldemort made sure it stayed that way. Voldemort's command of fear was real. He split souls, bent giants to his will, raised inferi, and haunted dreams. But fear alone does not win wars. Adaptation does, and adaptation was something the Death Eaters never mastered. They never understood the changing world, and so they couldn't control it. Like phantoms from another century, they haunted a world they no longer understood, and the world pushed back. There's an old Muggle saying, "You fight with the army you have." But Voldemort refused to do even that. He fought with the army he imagined, a grand, archaic legion of wizards, untouched by time, powerful through purity. But that imagined army could not withstand real resistance, because real resistance comes with surprises, with electricity, with media, with the thousands of tiny ways in which the Muggle world defends itself every day. The Death Eaters had magic, yes, but they did not have imagination. They lacked the creativity to look outside their own culture, their own rules. They wielded wands with deadly skill, but they never learned how to flip a switch, pull a trigger, or decode a message, and in the end that wasn't just a flaw, it was a fatal flaw, one that cost them everything they sought to own. Their castles of terror fell not because they were outmatched in power, but because they fought a 21st century world as if it were still the Dark Ages. And though magic can kill, it cannot outlast the future, not when the future holds wires, satellites, and the will to understand them. In the Wizarding War, ideology blinded the Death Eaters more than any spell ever could. And the saddest truth of all may be this: had they simply looked at the world they wanted to conquer, they might have seen the tools to do it. But they never did, because they never believed Muggles were worth learning from. And that is why they lost. Number 20, their selective memory. There was always something paradoxical about the Death Eaters. Feared across magical Britain, cloaked in shadows, marked by the Dark Lord himself, they wielded terrifying spells and a boundless cruelty. Yet behind that terror lurked a puzzling, almost comical inconsistency, a kind of selective amnesia that undermined their every move. While the wizarding world trembled at their name, it was often teenagers. Inexperienced and half-trained, who unraveled their most important secrets. One could be forgiven for assuming the Death Eaters lacked any institutional memory, any sense of caution, or even a basic understanding of the magical tools available to expose them. The most egregious example of this forgetfulness was the mishandling of Horcruxes, the very essence of Voldemort's immortality. Items of such unspeakable power should have been hidden in the most impenetrable places, protected by enchantments even Dumbledore would struggle to break. Instead, they were scattered in places so absurdly vulnerable that it almost bordered on self-sabotage. One of them, Tom Riddle's diary, was casually given to Lucius Malfoy, who decided to plant it on a schoolgirl. No protective enchantments, no safeguards. Just an 11-year-old child as a test subject for an object containing a fragment of Voldemort's soul. Even Bellatrix Lestrange, the most fanatically loyal Death Eater, committed a blunder of monumental proportions. She entrusted Helga Hufflepuff's cup, another Horcrux, to her family vault at Gringotts. Granted, Gringotts was secure, but Bellatrix seemed to forget that goblins were not beyond manipulation. A simple disguise, a bit of stolen hair, and Polyjuice potion allowed Harry, Ron, and Hermione to break into what should have been one of the most secure vaults in Britain. They even brought a dragon with them on the way out. Bellatrix didn't consider that Hermione, the brightest witch of her age, might think to imitate her. The idea that a trio of teenagers could slip past her precautions never even crossed her mind. As bizarre as it sounds, one of the Horcruxes was hidden in a cupboard. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, a legendary artifact, spent years in the Room of Requirement, a place accessible to any Hogwarts student with a vague idea of what they wanted to find. Tom Riddle placed it there when he was still a student, and the Death Eaters never retrieved it, never tracked it, never even suspected where it was. They forgot the simplest rule that children are curious, that someone would eventually find it, especially in a room designed to give you exactly what you need. The trend of underestimating magical detection tools was perhaps the most baffling. Veritaserum, a potion capable of forcing truth from even the most hardened liar, was barely considered. Death Eaters committed murders, orchestrated elaborate deceptions, and tortured people. But the idea that their captives might be given Veritaserum or interrogated by trained legilimens seemed not to register. It was as if they assumed the ministry would always be too slow or too cowardly to take action. They failed to recognize that secrets once spoken have a tendency to spread, especially in times of war. Voldemort himself was guilty of this strategic blindness. He placed a fragment of his soul inside Nagini, a living, breathing snake that slithered beside him constantly. In doing so, he turned a living being into a glowing target. Dumbledore had long suspected that Voldemort had rendered himself nearly immortal. The snake's unnaturally close proximity to the Dark Lord was a red flag no strategist should have ignored. And yet, Nagini was paraded through the war like a mascot, present during battles, executions, and clandestine meetings. No one thought to hide her, no one thought she might be tracked. Perhaps the most chilling example of magical negligence was the Battle of the Department of Mysteries. A dozen Death Eaters stormed the Ministry in pursuit of a prophecy. They didn't consider the magical protections around the Hall of Prophecies or the unpredictable nature of the place. More importantly, they failed to anticipate that a group of schoolchildren might outmaneuver them. "You're the weak one," Harry told Bellatrix later, "and you'll never know love or friendship, and I feel sorry for you." His words, though said in anger, carried truth. They were blind not just to love but to the basic tools of survival. Their forgetfulness extended to geography as well. Malfoy Manor, the seat of one of the most powerful pure-blood families, became a prison, a war room, and a repository of secrets. Yet no spells were cast to prevent house elf interference. Dobby, once enslaved by the Malfoys, managed to apparate in and out freely. He saved the prisoners, exposed critical information, and humiliated Bellatrix, who shrieked, "You dirty little monkey!" Too late. The damage was done. The oversight was fatal. Death Eaters also seemed to disregard the danger of magical mirrors. Sirius Black's mirror, given to Harry, was one such object. Although its full powers were only revealed after Sirius's death, it remained a symbol of how knowledge, when mishandled or underestimated, could unravel even the darkest plans. "I should have told you," Sirius had said earlier. But the Death Eaters didn't even ask what Harry knew. They never suspected the boy might have magical communication devices at his disposal. They made the same mistake with the Marauder's map, a powerful artifact that revealed the exact locations of every person at Hogwarts. Fred and George Weasley stole it from Filch's office, and it changed hands until Harry used it to monitor everything that happened within the castle walls. Death Eaters, many of whom had once attended the school, should have remembered that the map existed. Some of them had even known the Marauders personally. And yet, no one searched for it. No one tried to destroy it. In truth, their downfall lay not in the bravery of children, but in the arrogance of their own assumptions. They relied on brute force, on fear, on the idea that they could crush resistance by sheer might. Planning, foresight, and even magical intelligence were afterthoughts. They sent Dementors to Hogwarts, forgetting that Patronuses could repel them. They placed traitors in the Order of the Phoenix, never imagining that some might switch sides again. They thought Snape was theirs until the very end. They were wrong. Voldemort's attack on Hogwarts was a tactical disaster. He gave Harry time to find the Horcruxes, even called a truce while the boy hunted them down. He sent his army into the heart of enemy territory, believing the fear of his name would win the battle for him. But fear cannot shield against fire, cannot stop a sword, cannot outsmart a determined child. "Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living," Dumbledore said, yet perhaps the Death Eaters, in their blindness, were the ones most deserving of pity. Even the escape from Malfoy Manor was a comedy of errors. Harry and Ron used a broken wand to disarm a group of seasoned Death Eaters. Hermione hexed Bellatrix. Dobby's intervention was the final blow. A house elf, a creature of servitude, brought the Dark Lord's plans to ruin. It was as if the Death Eaters forgot that in magic, even the smallest act of kindness could become a weapon. They also underestimated the power of memory. Neville Longbottom, the shy boy they once dismissed, became a symbol of defiance. They forgot his parents, tortured into madness by Bellatrix, and failed to notice how grief can turn into strength. Neville destroyed Nagini, delivering the final blow that made Voldemort mortal. He used the Sword of Gryffindor, which appeared to him because of his courage. Death Eaters never considered that the sword could be summoned by loyalty alone. Rodolphus Lestrange, Bellatrix's husband, faded into obscurity after Azkaban. No plots, no clever traps. He, like many others, simply rejoined Voldemort's side, assuming that loyalty would mask incompetence. They forgot that the war had changed the rules. Loyalty without strategy was a liability, not an asset. The Carrows, Amicus, and Alecto ran Hogwarts like tyrants. They forgot that the school itself had defences, secret rooms, loyal ghosts, enchanted suits of armour. They forgot about Peeves, who wreaked havoc with glee. They forgot about Luna Lovegood, who spread hope in the shadows. They forgot about the Room of Requirement again. They acted like invaders in a castle that had always protected its children. Perhaps the most poetic moment came when Draco Malfoy, once so eager to prove himself, faltered. Tasked with killing Dumbledore, he hesitated. The Death Eaters thought loyalty could be ordered, that fear could substitute for conviction. But Draco, even broken by pressure, retained a flicker of conscience. Snape took the fall. Another plan undone by human emotion, something Voldemort never understood. In the end, their selective memory was their undoing. They remembered bloodlines, curses, old alliances, and ancient hatreds. But they forgot the things that mattered: how quickly children grow, how memory persists, how magic flows through unexpected hands. They forgot the value of love, the pain of loss, the cost of arrogance. They forgot that even a single enchanted object in the wrong hands could unmake them all. Their tragedy was not merely defeat, but blindness. They saw themselves as shadows, inevitable and absolute. But the light, messy, unpredictable, human light, always found a way through. They forgot how to plan, how to adapt, how to see the world as it was. In the silence of their ruined strongholds, among the ashes of their failed conquests, that forgetfulness echoed louder than any curse. And while their names may still cause unease in hushed conversations, it is not their power that endures in memory. It is their astonishing, almost comical inability to remember what mattered most. That magic, for all its darkness and danger, belongs to those who respect it, not to those who forget its lessons. The Death Eaters were feared, but in the end they were fools, armed with dark. Spells, they forgot the one thing even children understood: never underestimate what love, knowledge, and courage can do when combined. Number 21, why didn't they use other countries? Of all the questions that linger about Voldemort's rise and fall, perhaps the most striking is not how he amassed so many followers, but why he limited his reach to the British Isles. The Death Eaters, who claimed to represent a new magical order, never stepped beyond the shores of the United Kingdom. This is not merely a tactical oversight, it speaks to the very core of what they were. While France, Bulgaria, Eastern Europe, and the Nordic lands all had rich, magical traditions and powerful witches and wizards, Voldemort made no effort to court them. He remained stubbornly domestic, and in doing so, revealed the true nature of his movement. The magical world, as described by Dumbledore and evidenced by the Triwizard Tournament, is vast and interconnected. When Durmstrang Institute sent Victor Krum, it was more than a gesture. It was a sign that magic respected no borders. Durmstrang, known for its tolerance of the dark arts, would have seemed a fertile recruiting ground for Voldemort. Yet Karkaroff, once a Death Eater himself, abandoned that ideology and betrayed his former master. Voldemort never pursued other Durmstrang alumni. He never visited Scandinavia, whose wizards practiced aggressive magic in isolation. Nor did he send emissaries. It is as though he refused to see any part of the world beyond the foggy moors of Britain. This insularity is not just geographical, it's psychological. Voldemort never wanted a global revolution, he wanted a purification. The ideology he espoused wasn't one of expansion, but of return to a mythical, pure, wizarding society that never existed. His obsession with blood purity made collaboration difficult. Other countries had different standards of lineage, different historical wounds. To Voldemort, only British bloodlines mattered. His war was not about power on a world stage. It was about vengeance rooted in an English orphanage and a castle in Scotland. When he returned to power in Goblet of Fire, Voldemort said, "I, who have gone further than anybody along the path that leads to immortality." This boastful arrogance was the hallmark of a man who believed he alone could reshape the world, not with allies, not with armies, with domination. If he had reached out, if he had sought dark forces beyond Britain, he may have found them. Grindelwald, after all, had inspired followers across continents, but Voldemort viewed Grindelwald with disdain, calling him a fool for seeking something so naive as the greater good. International diplomacy, even among dark wizards, was not in Voldemort's nature. The Death Eaters were not a political machine, they were a cult of personality. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps the most fanatical of all, did not serve for ideology. She served for him. Her devotion bordered on religious. Her insanity was not a side effect of her service, it was cultivated. The same was true of Lucius Malfoy, who did not plot alliances abroad, but sought favour at court. Even when Voldemort was weak and hiding in Albania, he made no attempt to engage with the Eastern European magical communities. He could have infiltrated, manipulated, promised them riches or power, but he saw no equals, only tools, and tools, once foreign, were never trustworthy in his eyes. Consider the moment in Order of the Phoenix when Voldemort invades the Ministry of Magic. His goal is not to seize Britain for the sake of a greater magical empire. He wants the prophecy. His obsession with Harry Potter, one boy, one prophecy, one country, is symptomatic of a vision that does not stretch beyond the English Channel. He wants to win not against a world of opponents, but against the child who survived him. His war is personal, not strategic. During the Second Wizarding War, Voldemort took control of the British Ministry of Magic. He had all the trappings of a totalitarian regime. He controlled the press, censored the truth, hunted dissenters. And yet in all of this, there were no ambassadors to other magical governments. The International Confederation of Wizards stood untouched. The French Ministry of Magic remained neutral. He could have sent Draco Malfoy to Beauxbatons as a diplomat. He could have called on giants in the Carpathians, but Voldemort was not interested in governing. He was interested in purging. The case of Fenrir Greyback illustrates this well. Greyback was a werewolf, violent and feared even among dark creatures. He was a tool of fear, not diplomacy. Voldemort employed him not to forge alliances with magical beasts, but to terrorize families, especially those aligned with the Order. He weaponized darkness, but never organized it. He scattered fear like seeds, but refused to cultivate foreign soil. Grindelwald, by contrast, had a global vision. He operated from Nurmengard, sought the Deathly Hallows, and reached out to allies in multiple nations. His message, however twisted, was designed for mass appeal. For the greater good could inspire or seduce beyond language barriers. Voldemort's message, purity, control, and dominance, was steeped in British magical elitism. It was hard to sell outside a context of class and bloodline unique to Britain's wizarding nobility. One might ask, what about the goblins, the centaurs, the giants? These non-human magical beings existed across borders. Voldemort did manage to recruit some giants, but even this was a shallow partnership. He used intimidation, not diplomacy. His alliance with the giants was transactional. There was no vision for a magical world united under a common purpose, only subservience, bought through fear and fire. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore and Harry visit Slughorn, who says, "You must be the one to destroy him, Harry. It must be you." The singularity of this prophecy, the idea that Voldemort's end would come not through an army but a duel, reflects how narrowly Voldemort viewed his enemies. He did not believe in resistance on a global scale. He believed in supremacy by fear. He saw no need to gather supporters beyond the Malfoys, the Carrows, and other British families whose lineage traced to Slytherin's ideals. The Death Eater's internal hierarchy also discouraged outside involvement. It was rigid, suspicious, and paranoid. When Yaxley gained power within the ministry, it wasn't through merit but through favour. No outsider could navigate such a system. Even Snape, half-trusted as he was, had to constantly prove himself. There was no room for international allies. They would never be trusted. They would never be given power. The Death Eaters were not built for growth. They were built for control. It is important to remember that Voldemort himself had no ties to other magical cultures. He studied at Hogwarts. He worked at Borgin and Berks. He never travelled, never sought foreign mentors. His understanding of magic beyond Britain was limited to myth and artifact. He scoured the world for Horcrux materials, like Helga Hufflepuff's cup or Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, but never for people. He collected symbols of power, not alliances. The most tragic example of Voldemort's isolation is his final stand at Hogwarts. By that point, news of his return had spread. The world was watching. France had sent witches to fight at the Battle of Hogwarts, Fleur Delacour among them. But they came not for Voldemort or for Britain, but for the cause of good. No foreign wizard came to stand by Voldemort. Not one. He stood alone with his shrinking band of fanatics against a world he never tried to understand. The mythology he built could not survive beyond his borders. In Romania, dragons were bred and studied. In Bulgaria, Quidditch reigned as a magical art. In Scandinavia, ancient magical rites preserved powers Voldemort never learned. These lands might have provided strength had he been capable of sharing it. But Voldemort was incapable of partnership. His darkness was not a tide sweeping the globe. It was a poison confined to one garden. Even among his own followers, unity was illusory. When things turned dire, they fled. Lucius begged for mercy. Narcissa betrayed him with a lie to save her son. Bellatrix died protecting her lord, but she was alone in that loyalty. If Voldemort had built something greater than fear, if he had inspired love, loyalty, vision, perhaps foreign witches and wizards would have joined him. Instead, he inspired silence. The Death Eaters' failure to expand is not just a military failure, it is a moral one. They were never a movement, they were never a nation. They were a shattered mirror, reflecting only the obsessions of their master. Voldemort's isolation doomed him not just to defeat, but to irrelevance. In the end, Harry did not defeat a global army. He defeated a man who could not see beyond his own reflection. The wizarding world beyond Britain thrived after Voldemort's fall. France reformed its magical schools, Bulgaria produced new champions, even Durmstrang distanced itself from its dark past, but Voldemort left no legacy abroad, no ideology that endured. He did not build, he did not inspire. He ruled briefly and then vanished, leaving behind nothing but ash and memory. That is why his silence beyond Britain matters, because in that silence we hear the truth. He was never a world threat. He was only ever a ghost haunting one country's dreams. Number 22, their questionable sense of style. Lucius Malfoy stood beneath the cold, unforgiving sky, his mask catching the pale light of the moon like a polished silver coin. He adjusted the flowing black cloak draped over his shoulders, its edges swirling dramatically in the wind. There was a reason he dressed this way. All the Death Eaters did. It was a uniform, yes, but it was more than that. It was a performance, a display, a declaration of fear, and it was also, curiously, fashion. For a group that claimed to hate Muggles, the Death Eaters shared a fascination with theatricality that wouldn't be out of place on a Muggle runway. They didn't merely fight. They arrived, they appeared. They announced themselves with roaring entrances and ominous cloaks, and they vanished in dramatic puffs of smoke. It was as though the fear they sought to inspire needed not just dark magic, but also costume design. It is an odd detail that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The Death Eaters, for all their murderous intent and ideology of purity, were absurdly stylized. Their signature masks, cold and ornate, were not simply practical tools for anonymity. They were artful, engraved, metallic, and elaborate. These weren't crude attempts at hiding identity. They were crafted to evoke terror, yes, but they were also strangely beautiful in their own grim way. The image was consistent: long, flowing black robes, skeletal masks, hoods pulled low, a monochromatic fashion code that bordered on the ceremonial. Like priests of an unholy order, their presence relied on spectacle as much as on sorcery. Trixis Lestrange, for instance, needed no mask to be terrifying, and yet she wore the Death Eater uniform with a fervour that suggested pride. She twirled her wand like a dagger and laughed in a voice that cracked the air, but behind the shrill mania was the same long cloak, the same dark silhouette. Even when not explicitly donning the full costume, Bellatrix clung to its elements: black corsets, twisted fabrics, lace like cobwebs. She was as much a performer as a duelist. She once stood over a tortured victim and raised her arms like a stage actress, basking in applause. That wasn't strategy, that was theatre, and it was theatre Voldemort encouraged. For a leader obsessed with control, the Dark Lord allowed, even demanded, a certain visual spectacle from his followers. The uniform created unity. It erased individualism, which he feared. It was also a tool of propaganda. A town under attack didn't just fear death, they feared the moment masked figures would appear in the mist, like spirits summoned from nightmare. It was psychological warfare, but it was also flawed, because in their obsession with intimidation, the Death Eaters abandoned subtlety. Their aesthetic became their identity, and their identity became a weakness. There is irony in this flamboyance. The Death Eaters portrayed themselves as the elite, the chosen few, heirs of Salazar Slytherin, and warriors of blood purity. Yet their methods were closer to that of Muggle cults or gangs, whose members mark themselves with symbolism and dress. Like the skull tattoo they bore, the dark mark, it was all about branding. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to be remembered. They didn't just want obedience, they wanted awe. But awe can decay into ridicule, and many wizards found their costumes laughable. They looked like a bunch of extras from a bad play, one Aura reportedly commented after a failed attack in Ottery St. Catchpole. Alastair Moody, a man who understood war better than most, saw through the facade. "They dress it up all they like," he said once, "but it's still murder they're selling." And yet the Order of the Phoenix never countered with similar flair. They wore no uniforms. They didn't march in lines or chant incantations in unison. They blended in, disguised themselves, worked silently. Where the Death Eaters demanded attention, the Order preferred invisibility. Where the Death Eaters roared, the Order whispered. And still, it was the Death Eaters who were hunted, tracked, and known. Take the attack at the Quidditch World Cup. The Death Eaters descended in masks and capes, setting fire to the camps and levitating terrified Muggle hosts into the air. They made a show of it, as always. But this event backfired spectacularly. The Ministry was alerted within minutes. Witnesses described their attire in detail. A masked man in black robes was spotted dragging a young woman into the woods. It was spectacle, but it was evidence. The more they appeared in their uniform, the more they were noticed, remembered, and identified. Even during the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, their theatricality proved a hindrance. When Harry and his friends broke into the Ministry in Order of the Phoenix, the Death Eaters didn't ambush them quietly. They arrived with fanfare. The sudden appearance of Lucius Malfoy, fully cloaked and masked, was less about strategy and more about drama. His booming voice echoed in the room. "You're a fool, Harry Potter, and you will lose everything." A haunting line, but a foolish move. His appearance gave the Order time to arrive and counterattack. Had Lucius chosen subtlety, had he worn the face of a ministry official or approached in disguise, he might have captured the prophecy. This lack of subtlety extended even to their most critical operations. In Half-Blood Prince, when Draco Malfoy smuggled Death Eaters into Hogwarts, they could have blended in. They had time. They could have changed into student robes or even stolen staff garments. Instead, they stormed the castle in full uniform, announcing their presence. One Death Eater even shattered a window for no strategic reason other than dramatics. Again, fear was the tool, but the cost was exposure. In a fortress like Hogwarts, such exposure only made resistance easier to organize. Contrast this with Severus Snape, who spent years operating as a spy. He wore no cloak, no mask, and because of this he remained useful. Albus Dumbledore trusted him. Voldemort used him. He flowed between sides precisely because he refused to perform the Death Eater aesthetic. His allegiance was hidden by his plainness, and in the end it was Snape, not the masked assassins, who came closest to changing the tide of the war. There is a lesson in this contrast. Not all war is fought in spectacle. Often it is won in silence. The masks themselves were an oddity. They didn't just hide identity, they depersonalized. In Goblet of Fire, when Barty Crouch Jr. is unmasked, there's a sense of surprise, not because he was disguised, but because he was not wearing the Death Eater uniform in daily life. As Mad-Eye Moody, he wore practical gear, no theatrics. It worked. No one suspected him. That deception lasted months. Meanwhile, Death Eaters in full regalia were instantly suspect wherever they walked. It was as though they forgot the point of a mask, not just to frighten, but to blend in when needed. It is possible, of course, that Voldemort encouraged this obsession with style because it pleased his ego. Every masked follower was a reflection of him, a mirror of his own transformation. He too abandoned his face for something skeletal and alien. He too dressed in flowing black. The aesthetic of the Death Eaters was not created for practicality. It was created in his image, and in that image was narcissism. Voldemort did not want hidden knives. He wanted banners. He wanted fear. He wanted fireworks. But in the end, he became predictable. Consider the way their entrances became clichés. A Death Eater would appear in a swirl of black. Fire would ignite. A scream would echo, and then the chaos would begin. But after the first shock, this pattern became routine. Even children at Hogwarts knew the signs. When they saw green light and cloaked figures, they knew what was coming. There was no mystery left, no room for confusion. They made themselves easy to anticipate. Theatrical terror has a short shelf life. Even during the final battle at Hogwarts, the Death Eaters kept to their aesthetic. While students wore mixed clothing, house robes, or whatever they could grab, the Death Eaters arrived as though for a ritual, masked, hooded, flowing. They seemed less like warriors and more like a cult reenacting ancient rites. Some of them, like Yaxley or Roll, died without ever removing their masks. It was as though their identity had become the mask. They had worn it so long they didn't know how to be anything else. Not once do we hear of a Death Eater successfully infiltrating the Ministry or Hogwarts by disguise. Polyjuice potion exists, glamour charms exist, but they chose not to use them. Instead, they relied on fear and iconography. They became so attached to their image that they forgot how to be invisible. In a world of espionage, they acted like parade floats. And while their iconography terrified many, it also revealed everything. Strategy became hostage to symbolism. The question remains, why did none of them suggest a change? Why did no Death Eater say, "Let us wear grey robes today, let us disappear among the crowd"? Perhaps they feared Voldemort's wrath, perhaps they believed too much in the image they projected, or perhaps they were too vain. For many, like Lucius and Bellatrix, their identity was not just in the wand, but in the cloak. They felt powerful in costume. They became the fear they wore. They forgot that to win, one must sometimes become the enemy. One must sometimes vanish. In the end, their style was not a symbol of dominance. It was a fatal flaw. Every time a silver mask caught the light, every time a cloak billowed too dramatically, they exposed themselves. Their style gave them away. It told the world who they were, where they stood, and what they planned. While the Order moved in shadow, the Death Eaters marched under spotlights. And in the world of war, the one who hides best often survives longest. The Death Eaters didn't understand that. They dressed for fear, but they died for it too. Number 23, why didn't they use Polyjuice potion strategically? Why? Of all the weapons available to wizards in J.K. Rowling's world, Polyjuice potion stands as one of the most powerful and disruptive. It requires only a sample of hair and enough brewing time to turn a person into anyone they choose, indistinguishable even to the most trained eye. We saw its devastating effectiveness when Barty Crouch Jr. used it to impersonate Alastair Moody for nearly a full school year. And yet, for all its usefulness, the Death Eaters, followers of Lord Voldemort, self-proclaimed masters of dark magic, hardly used it. The question hangs in the air like the fog above a graveyard. Why didn't they? When Harry, Ron, and Hermione used the potion to infiltrate the Ministry of Magic in the Deathly Hallows, they succeeded in slipping past security, stealing valuable information, and disrupting the regime's oppressive mechanisms. With only a few hairs and a solid plan, they moved through the heart of the Death Eaters' new power base undetected. The risks were enormous, but the result proved the method's worth. In contrast, the Death Eaters, who had every opportunity and motive, never attempted something similar. Not once did they impersonate Kingsley Shacklebolt, Amelia Bones, or even Cornelius Fudge when he still held influence. Consider the case of Barty Crouch Jr. in The Goblet of Fire, acting on his own initiative. Driven by loyalty to the Dark Lord and guided by the cunning of Peter Pettigrew, he captured the real Mad-Eye Moody and used Polyjuice potion to assume his identity. The plan was brilliant, nearly flawless. "He's been using Polyjuice potion," Dumbledore explains grimly, "and has been impersonating Moody all year." And yet this operation was not born of Voldemort's direct orders. It was an improvisation. If anything, Voldemort seemed to regard Polyjuice as a useful but secondary tactic, not a foundation of his strategy. This absence of strategic use suggests something deeper than mere oversight. Voldemort was not ignorant of the potion's power. He relied on Crouch Jr.'s success to regain his body. But once he returned, he never deployed the tactic systematically. He had legions of loyal followers, many cunning, resourceful, and ruthless. The likes of Bellatrix Lestrange, Lucius Malfoy, and even Severus Snape had access to rare ingredients and brilliant minds, yet there was no widespread campaign of impersonation, no sudden disappearances of key figures replaced by Death Eater imposters, no ministry officials acting strangely under Polyjuice influence. Why? One reason may lie in the nature of Voldemort himself. His obsession with power and purity led him to dismiss subterfuge in favor of domination. He believed in overwhelming force, not shadows. Even at his height, his strategy leaned toward spectacle, dark marks in the sky, public killings, loud proclamations of superiority. He did not value stealth as a path to victory. To him, cunning was only admirable when it furthered terror, not when it hid in the bodies of others. Perhaps in Voldemort's twisted mind, taking someone else's shape was a form of weakness, an admission that their own identity wasn't terrifying enough. There is also the matter of ego. Voldemort's inner circle was not made of selfless agents. Bellatrix Lestrange, for example, would never have lowered herself to drink someone else's essence, to behave like a Muggle-born Auror or a ministry clerk. Her identity was everything to her. Even Lucius Malfoy, with his refined demeanour, would have balked at the indignity of masquerading as some blood traitor. These were not spies, they were aristocrats of terror, consumed by self-importance and the illusion of superiority. To wear another's face to suppress one's pure blood essence, it would have been repulsive to them. Another possibility is logistical. Polyjuice potion is complex and time-consuming. It requires lacewing flies stewed for 21 days, powdered bicorn horn, leeches, knotgrass, fluxweed, picked at the full moon, and shredded boomslang skin. During times of war, with the wizarding world locked in paranoia, these ingredients became more difficult to acquire. Even Severus Snape, a potions master, had difficulties sourcing rare materials during the rise of the Dark Lord. And beyond ingredients lies a bigger hurdle, acquiring the target's hair. Unlike Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who had access to offices, clothing, and allies, the Death Eaters operated on the margins. Taking a single hair from a vigilant Auror is no small feat. There's also the matter of risk. Polyjuice impersonation is temporary and dangerous. The potion wears off. In the event of miscalculation, one might find themselves mid-conversation in their original form. Remember what happened to Hermione when she accidentally used a cat hair. Polyjuice is not foolproof. It requires knowledge of the person being impersonated, including their mannerisms, tone, speech, and habits. Death Eaters weren't trained for this. They were brutes and torturers, not actors. A poorly executed impersonation could lead to immediate exposure and retribution. The Ministry of Magic, while corrupt and inefficient, did possess safeguards. Dumbledore's Order of the Phoenix was not blind. Alastor Moody, before his death, drilled in constant vigilance. Even during Fudge's regime, magical identification methods existed. Patronuses, for instance, are unique. A person under Polyjuice could copy a body, but not a Patronus. As Kingsley Shacklebolt once used his own to deliver messages, this detail mattered. An imposter could be unmasked by such small, magical fingerprints. And the stakes were always high. Impersonate the wrong person, and you might walk into a trap set by the Order itself. Let's not forget that Barty Crouch Jr.'s plan worked only because he had complete control over his victim. He imprisoned Moody in a magical trunk, fed him just enough to keep him alive, and stole hair daily. Without this captive, the ruse would have crumbled within days. The same method could not be easily repeated without drawing attention. Abducting someone like Kingsley or Tonks would set off alarms, and if the real person was killed, their Patronus and magical records would vanish, an immediate red flag. Another curious detail lies in the nature of loyalty. Voldemort inspired devotion through fear. His followers were not equals, they were pawns. Delegating subtle and critical tasks to such individuals would have been unwise. He trusted no one. He barely tolerated their presence, often punishing them for minor failures. In The Half-Blood Prince, we see his cruel expectations and how easily he discarded even his most devoted followers. Would he really entrust someone like Fenrir Greyback with a mission requiring finesse and timing? Additionally, Voldemort's disdain for Muggle inventions and innovations perhaps extended to certain magical technologies. Polyjuice potion, while brilliant, could be seen as a trick, something not rooted in power or dominance but in sleight of hand. The Dark Lord saw himself as a god among mortals. Why would a god resort to illusion when he could conquer through force and fear? The irony, of course, is that these illusions often proved more effective than brute strength, but Voldemort was never one to value irony. Let's recall the break-in at the Ministry led by Yaxley and other Death Eaters. Instead of using disguise or deception, They used political pressure, blackmail, and threats. The transformation of Pius Thickness into a puppet was done through the Imperious Curse, not Polyjuice. This reveals another preference, control over mimicry. The Imperious Curse allowed them to manipulate from within without the risk of exposure or the hassle of brewing potions. It was invasive, irreversible in some cases, and absolute. Polyjuice had limits. The Imperious did not, at least in the eyes of the Death Eaters. There is a thematic thread in Rowling's narrative that cannot be ignored. Polyjuice potion is almost exclusively a tool of the good, or at least the clever. Harry and his friends use it out of necessity, never for glory. Even Barty Crouch Jr., the only Death Eater to use it successfully, ultimately met his end at Dumbledore's hand. Polyjuice is a tool of adaptation, not domination, and adaptation was something Voldemort and his followers refused to do. Their ideology was rigid, their thinking dogmatic. They believed the world should bend to them, not the other way around. There's also the matter of surveillance. During the First and Second Wizarding Wars, anti-imposter spells became increasingly common. In the Deathly Hallows, the Order routinely checked for imposters. Polyjuice might get you past the front gate, but constant magical scans would expose you. Polyjuice offers no protection from legilimency. It does not duplicate magical aura, and once exposed, the punishment was swift and brutal. The Death Eaters were not immune to fear. Even when they seized Hogwarts, the Death Eaters used force, not infiltration. The Carrows, Amicus, and Alecto didn't impersonate anyone. They were installed like weapons. Their job was to punish, not to persuade. Snape, the one man who did infiltrate, used something far more dangerous than Polyjuice: trust. He walked the fine line between light and dark, and only his genius allowed it. He did not change his face, he changed his allegiance, at least outwardly. And even then he nearly died for it. The choice not to use Polyjuice potion speaks volumes about the limitations of Voldemort's army. They were strong but not smart. They were cruel but not clever. They preferred fear to finesse. They believed their blood gave them right, and their magic gave them might. Strategy was for the weak. Deception was for cowards. Their strength, ironically, became their flaw. In their refusal to adapt, they left themselves vulnerable. In the end, it was Harry and his friends, armed with compassion, improvisation, and yes, Polyjuice potion, who succeeded. Not because they were stronger, but because they were willing to use every tool available. They understood that war required flexibility, that to survive was to deceive, that magic was more than just firepower. It was thought, it was planning, it was misdirection. The Death Eaters never understood that, and it cost them everything. Number 24, their strange hierarchy. The Death Eaters called themselves the most feared force in the wizarding world, yet their structure was anything but disciplined. While they swore loyalty to Lord Voldemort, the day-to-day functioning of their ranks operated in chaos. Voldemort's obsession with immortality left him absent for years at a time. During his first fall, he disappeared completely. And even before that, during the years he hunted for Horcruxes and explored the darkest corners of the magical world, his followers were left to interpret vague orders or to act on assumptions. This led to internal confusion, subtle power grabs, and a hierarchy that never truly existed, only the illusion of one. If there was a second in command, few could agree who it was. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps by sheer force of devotion. Her fanaticism for the Dark Lord knew no bounds. She killed without hesitation, screamed his name in ecstasy, and followed his vision without question. But devotion does not equal strategy. Bellatrix was not a leader, she was a weapon, sharp and unpredictable. Her madness alienated even her own allies, and her presence often intimidated more than it inspired. Others may have feared her, but they did not follow her. There is a key difference. Lucius Malfoy, on the other hand, held influence through wealth and political ties. He had access to the ministry, and unlike Bellatrix, he played a long game. But Lucius lacked courage. When Voldemort returned and chose to reside in Malfoy Manor, it was not a reward, it was a punishment, a method of asserting dominance over a once proud man. Lucius failed at the Department of Mysteries and lost the prophecy. Voldemort never forgave failure. After that, Lucius was sidelined, humiliated in front of his family and peers. No one could call him second in command with a straight face. Other names rise and fall when fans discuss the so-called structure. Rodolphus Lestrange had the family name and a long history of service, but he rarely spoke. His silence left a vacuum rather than presence. Barty Crouch Jr. was brilliant and cruel, but spent most of his post-Azkaban life impersonating Mad-Eye Moody. Antonin Dolohov was ruthless but directionless. Yaxley rose within the ministry ranks but lacked charisma. In every direction there were only fragments. No one filled the seat beneath Voldemort, because that seat never existed. J.K. Rowling's books offer no chart, no clear map of command. The Order of the Phoenix had Dumbledore, then Moody, McGonagall, and Kingsley. The Ministry had departments, job titles, lines of authority. Even the Marauders had an unofficial hierarchy. But the Death Eaters? They were shadows, each clawing for the Dark Lord's attention. Their meetings were often described not as strategy sessions, but performances. They were all in a large, dimly lit room, gathered around Voldemort like disciples, says the narrative in Half-Blood Prince. Not colleagues, not soldiers, disciples, worshippers, sheep. And what of when Voldemort was not present? Who issued the orders to track down the Longbottoms? Who decided to attack the Quidditch World Cup? There's no mention of formal briefings or structured missions. These were either impromptu acts of cruelty or vague commands filtered through rumour and fear. After Voldemort's rebirth in the graveyard, he didn't hand out badges or promote officers. Instead, he said, "You returned to me not out of loyalty, but out of fear." He knew his army did not stand on order, it stood on terror. Perhaps the clearest sign of their dysfunction lies in their failures. The Department of Mysteries' assault was poorly coordinated. The Snatchers during the Second Wizarding War, loosely connected to Death Eaters, captured people indiscriminately. Even among Voldemort's inner circle, mistakes were rampant. When the locket Horcrux was found missing, Voldemort lashed out without precision, torturing anyone who might be guilty. Narcissa Malfoy lied to him about Harry being dead. Severus Snape, his most trusted servant, was a double agent all along. An army with no accountability, no promotion path, and no central planning cannot function for long. Some of the most frightening followers were not Death Eaters at all. Fenrir Greyback, for instance, was a brutal werewolf with a taste for children. Voldemort used him like a weapon, but Fenrir was never branded with the dark mark. Why? Perhaps Voldemort preferred him as an outsider, someone to unleash without the burden of loyalty. This only further complicates the structure. There were Death Eaters, allies, servants, spies. No consistency, only a dark web of connection rooted in Voldemort's manipulations. And what of Severus Snape, the man Dumbledore trusted with his life? To the Death Eaters, Snape was powerful, close to the Dark Lord, and given enormous tasks. He was headmaster of Hogwarts, a position of control. Did others see him as a leader? Unlikely. Many distrusted him, especially Bellatrix. She grilled him at Spinner's End, questioning his loyalty. Even as he gave her answers that could have sufficed, her eyes burned with doubt. Snape had power, yes, but not authority. He held secrets, not followers. At Malfoy Manor, decisions were not made by vote or command structure. They were made by fear. When Charity Burbage hung above the table, begging for mercy, no one moved. Voldemort gave an order, Nagini executed it. The rest watched. This is not leadership, it is tyranny. Even Bellatrix, closest to Voldemort in devotion, did not act unless he demanded. Without Voldemort in the room, they turned to fear, not function. Death Eater behavior suggests they were more like a cult than a military group. Cults do not need hierarchies, they need a figurehead and a shared belief. That belief in this case was blood purity and Voldemort's supremacy. The rest was details. There were no ranks, because ranks implied trust, and Voldemort trusted no one. He divided them, kept them competing, whispering, betraying. That chaos made them loyal only to him, never to each other. Key moment is seen during the Battle of Hogwarts. When the tide turned against Voldemort, several Death Eaters fled. Others surrendered. Some, like the Malfoys, even switched sides. If the group had a second in command, someone who could rally them, they might have fought to the end. Instead, they crumbled. Narcissa lied to save her son. Lucius abandoned the battlefield. Bellatrix fought alone, wildly, and when she fell, the others barely reacted. Rowling never clarified these dynamics directly, but the narrative implies it. The only time Voldemort ever acknowledged a follower with something resembling a title was with Snape. He called him my most loyal servant. Yet even then he killed him for the Elder Wand. Loyalty meant nothing. There was no promotion, only punishment, no rise in ranks, only fall from grace. The structure of the Death Eaters was never a ladder, it was a pit. Some Death Eaters may have assumed they were more important. Lucius Malfoy strutted through the ministry with a walking stick and a smirk. Dolohov boasted of his victories, but the truth was that Voldemort's circle was like a mirror maze. Everyone saw themselves at the center, until Voldemort shattered the glass. Ambition was encouraged but never rewarded. Mistakes were fatal. No second in command survived long enough to matter. Even the branding with the dark mark offers clues. The mark burned when Voldemort summoned, not when a commander called, not when an order needed distribution, but only when the master himself beckoned. This central control ensured that all power remained in his hands. It was a magical leash. If Voldemort was absent, the leash loosened, and the dogs turned on each other or wandered off entirely. There was no internal compass. During the First Wizarding War, when Voldemort fell, the Death Eaters scattered. Some claimed Imperius, others vanished. A few, like Bellatrix, remained loyal from Azkaban, but the rest, opportunists, survivors. There was no one to pull them back together until Voldemort returned. And when he did, they returned not out of unity, but fear of retribution. There was no interim leader, no Shadow King, just silence, guilt, and paranoia. It's a mistake to view the Death Eaters as a structured organization. They were an extension of Voldemort's will, not independent actors. When he needed a task done, he picked someone at random or someone he wanted to test or punish. Failures were met with pain, not lessons. Successes were met with silence. Praise was rare. Trust was absent. What kind of structure can function like this? None that lasts. When viewed this way, the Death Eaters become less of a fearsome army and more of a tragic case study in manipulation. Voldemort's greatest magic wasn't his spells, it was his ability to convince others to destroy themselves in his name. No leader among them ever rose, because that would have threatened his throne. And Voldemort, like any tyrant, could never allow that, so they remained broken, leaderless, hungry for approval they would never earn. In the end, the Death Eaters collapsed not because Harry defeated Voldemort with superior magic, but because they had no foundation. They were a tower built on sand, a cult of personality with no future. Voldemort died, and so did the dream of a pure-blood utopia. Not one of them stepped forward to continue the fight, because none of them had ever known how to lead. They only knew how to follow a ghost. Number 25. Why did they even need Horcruxes? Lord Voldemort believed in fear more than logic. When he created Horcruxes, those monstrous vessels of fractured soul, he wasn't simply preparing for immortality. He was crafting a legacy. He was composing a symphony of dread, where every object would not only house a piece of his soul, but also radiate his magnificence, his cruelty, his invincibility. And yet, for all his power, for all the centuries of knowledge he harvested and mutilated, Voldemort made decisions that were deeply human, flawed, vain, short-sighted. Perhaps the most baffling element in his grand design was not the act of splitting his soul, but the ostentatious absurdity of how he hid each Horcrux. It is here the Death Eaters failed him most, by never questioning his madness. The diary was the first and perhaps the most telling, not because of what it did, but because of how it was used. Tom Riddle's diary wasn't just a Horcrux. It was a trap, a weaponized memory, a mechanism to reopen the Chamber of Secrets and awaken the basilisk. But why make it so active? Why not bury it in the mountains of Albania or sink it into the depths of the Atlantic? Because it wasn't enough to be immortal. Voldemort wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be feared. He wanted the memory of his 16-year-old self to continue seducing, corrupting, and killing, and not one Death Eater asked why a piece of their master's soul was given to a foolish girl in a cursed schoolbook. Then came Marvolo Gaunt's ring. Hidden in the ruins of his grandfather's hovel, it was surrounded by enchantments and curses so fierce that even Dumbledore nearly died unmaking them. But again, why the ring? Why something so precious and so visible? The stone in the ring was, after all, the Resurrection Stone, one of the fabled Deathly Hallows. Voldemort knew nothing of this. He simply thought it looked regal, ancient, significant. And that was enough. For a man who feared death more than pain, he still yearned for symbols, for trophies, for things that screamed, "Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair." The locket of Salazar Slytherin was another monument to arrogance, kept in a cave surrounded by inferi on a lake of poison behind a wall of blood. It was a theatrical performance of protection. The process to reach it was so convoluted that only someone mad enough to swim through necrotic water and drink poison willingly could hope to retrieve it. But Voldemort didn't care. He wasn't hiding the Horcrux from an enemy. He was building a monument to himself, with suffering as its cornerstone. The cave was meant to test, to terrify, and ultimately to kill, not to protect. Even Helga Hufflepuff's cup, though smaller and more discreet, was placed in the Lestrange vault in Gringotts, a place so secure, so visibly wealthy, and connected to his inner circle, it virtually invited attention. Bellatrix was loyal, yes, but she was also loud, dramatic, and not exactly the keeper of secrets. Why trust her with such a thing? Because she worshipped him. And Voldemort, craving worship, didn't hide his soul where it would be forgotten. He placed it in her vault because he wanted her to know she was chosen, not for practicality, not for safety, purely for adoration. The diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw was perhaps the only Horcrux hidden with genuine strategy. Placed in the Room of Requirement, it was lost among generations of forgotten junk, invisible even to Hogwarts itself. But this decision wasn't born of humility. Tom Riddle hid it there as a student during a time when his narcissism had not yet exploded into full theatrical madness. Back then he was still learning, still maneuvering, still pretending to be something he wasn't. And in that rare moment of restraint, he created the only Horcrux that remained undiscovered for decades. But that didn't last. Once he rose again, the flare returned. The masks fell. The madness took over. The snake, Nagini, was a living Horcrux, a creature that slithered by his side, drank from the same bowls, killed on command. It was the most foolish of all. Living beings are fragile, they bleed, they age, they die. And yet Voldemort trusted her not just with his soul, but as a companion, a confidant. Why? Because she understood Parseltongue? Because she was a symbol of his serpent fetish? No, it was about domination. Nagini was not an object. She was a pet, a trophy of his supremacy over life. And still not one Death Eater questioned the idea of housing a piece of their master's soul in a snake that could be stabbed, decapitated, or blown apart by an angry wizard in a fit of panic. The final Horcrux was Harry Potter himself, a boy, a mistake, a symbol. Voldemort never meant to make him a Horcrux, and yet he became the most protected of all. No enchantments, no hiding, just life, love, a mother's sacrifice. And this too was never questioned. When Voldemort tried to kill Harry as a baby, not one Death Eater asked why their master had failed. Not one inquired why the killing curse had rebounded. They feared, they bowed, they followed. But therein lies the problem. The Death Eaters, as terrifying as they were, functioned not as advisors or strategists, but as followers, sycophants, zealots. None dared say, "My lord, why entrust your soul to a girl's diary?" Or perhaps the bank is not the best place for a cursed relic, especially if it screams when touched. They watched as he cursed the ring, trapped the locket, filled the cave with infernal bodies, and applauded. They obeyed. Even Lucius Malfoy, who was supposedly cunning, took the diary home like a cursed Christmas present and slipped it into the hands of a 12-year-old. It was not incompetence, it was worship. Voldemort built a cult, not an army. "There is no good and evil," he told Quirrell. "There is only power, and those too weak to seek it." And yet, for all his power, he surrounded himself with the weak, those who couldn't question, those who wouldn't argue, those who looked into the abyss and saw not horror, but majesty. Bellatrix carved his initials into her chest, Barty Crouch Jr. licked the hem of his robe, and Peter Pettigrew the rat gave up everything just to be near him. Not one of them ever asked why a god needed 7 hiding places. What's most fascinating is that Voldemort could have done so much better. The magical world is vast, full of enchanted vaults, endless forests, cursed mountains, unreachable planes of existence. There are objects that regenerate endlessly, stones that cannot be broken, places that shift through time and space. He could have hidden a piece of his soul inside the Department of Mysteries, in the veil that whispers, or in a cursed well in the forbidden forest. He could have merged it with an enchanted book that burns the eyes of those who read it, or placed it in the heart of an ancient tree that devours fire and steel. But he didn't. Because the Horcruxes were never just anchors, they were declarations. Each one said, "I was here, I conquered this, I claimed this for myself." In a way, Voldemort was a tragic artist, using pieces of his soul as paint, turning the world into a grotesque gallery of his own narcissism. And the Death Eaters? They were the audience, clapping, bowing, nodding. When Dumbledore explains Horcruxes to Harry, he says, "Lord Voldemort does not seem to understand that there are things much worse than death." But maybe he did. Maybe he feared irrelevance more than death. Maybe the idea of his legacy crumbling into silence, of his name being forgotten, was the real terror. The Horcruxes weren't just insurance, they were memory capsules, time bombs of terror designed to keep his myth alive, even if his body perished. But myth is a fragile thing when tethered to ego. Voldemort's downfall was not Harry, nor Dumbledore, nor the Order. It was his refusal to listen, his inability to question himself, his addiction to fear and spectacle. And the Death Eaters? They were his mirror. They reflected his madness, fed it, nurtured it, until it consumed them all. Even Snape, the only one who saw through the facade, never dared confront the absurdity of housing one's soul in a snake or a cursed cup. The tragedy of the Death Eaters is not just their cruelty, but their blindness. They had proximity to ultimate power, and yet never the courage to question its use. They could have saved him. They could have whispered doubts, proposed alternatives, offered reason. But in the end, they chose obedience over truth. And so, they perished, not just as villains, but as fools who followed a man who carved up his soul and scattered it like a treasure hunt designed by a megalomaniac child. Every Horcrux tells a story, not just of pain and death, but of ambition without wisdom. And every Death Eater who guarded one, whether by design or by ignorance, helped write that story. The story of a man who wanted to be immortal and instead became a cautionary tale.